The official report said the pilots had acted contrary to training. McClelland was sacked, Hunt was retired, a sentence confirming the by now accepted verdict of pilot error.
The basic understanding of pilot error is they, the pilots, messed it up. They made a mistake, they completely went off the rails.
The typical man that's in the street, he's going to say pilot error. And his interpretation of pilot error, I think, is going to be quite simply that the pilots got it wrong. They made a mistake. They didn't do their job as they should have done it.
Public disgrace for pilot error. But the passengers think that's too narrow a verdict.
I must say that I personally hold no grudge against them at all. I don't have an axe to grind against them. Like me, they were human beings who were caught up in an accident.
Sure, there was some pilot error. We know that from the report. But it's only part of the picture. The training, the backup, you know, the quality systems that go into put an aircraft like that in the air have to be absolutely right, and they clearly weren't.
They've done the job to the best of their ability, given the circumstances and surroundings, and yet, at the end of the day, everyone points the finger. Oh yes, that's the plane that the pilots turned off the engine. They may be contributory, but they certainly are not the reason for that plane crashing. They are one small cog in a wheel.
Wasn't it pilot error?
We certainly made a mistake, or we both made mistakes. Certainly not deliberately, and the question that we would like to answer is why did we make those mistakes?
The first question, was it a mistake or a mischance? As the plane climbed, a fan blade snapped in the left-hand engine. The first indication the pilots had was juddering and a smell of burning. The crew's training hadn't prepared them to identify this set of symptoms.
I got fire. Which one is it now?
Their instruments didn't alert them to which engine was at fault. The trusted option was trial and error.
You've got a choice of two, left or right. If you're uncertain, throttle it back. If it doesn't work, advance it and start again. It did work. We had well, so far as we were concerned, it completely cured the vibration, and various other things went away as well. We thought we got our problem identified.
Closing the healthy engine seemed to have cured the problem in the damaged one. The plane had an auto-throttle. This automatically adjusts the flow of fuel to each engine to equalize their performance. Because the left engine was damaged, it was less efficient. So the auto-throttle just pumped in more fuel to compensate. This caused the engine to judder and surge. Shutting down the right engine by hand disengaged the auto-throttle feeding both engines, so the oversupply of fuel to the left engine was stopped. So by throttling back the healthy engine, it cured the problem?
It gave all the indications of curing the problem, yeah. I can only say it gave all the indications now. So far as we were concerned then, it cured the problem.
On its descent to East Midlands, little power was required of the left engine. Unstressed, it behaved quite normally. At this point, only a clear indication from the instruments could have shaken the pilots' confidence that, by luck and judgment, they'd picked the correct engine to shut down first time. But they saw nothing to give them reason to reconsider what they'd done.
We had an unusual emergency here. There wasn't a big red light flashing on one of the engines that would have told them which one to do. They got a rather ill-defined emergency, and of course that's just the situation under which you've got to ensure that the instrumentation is designed as well as possible.
It certainly should have been well designed. Boeing had spared no effort to equip its new plane, the latest version of the world-beating 737, with a computer-driven high-tech cockpit. Out went old-fashioned dials with big white needles. But no one had reprogrammed the traditional perceptions of old-fashioned pilots.
It's a computer-generated idea to deal with computers, and the human mind doesn't quite see it the same way or as quickly. Talks very nicely to computers, but not to a human brain.
Research into the design of this sort of dial has been carried out at the RAF Institute of Aviation Medicine. The new dials are harder to read and easier to misinterpret.
The old-style cockpit in, for example, the 737-300 aircraft had apparently largish instruments with large white needles on. In the 400 series aircraft, the big white needles have been replaced with very, very much smaller cursors, and it takes longer to actually read the cursors than it does the big white needles.
The indicators on the new instruments are outside the dial. The little yellow cursors are 1/3 the length of the old-fashioned needles, simulated here on the computer. So there was no clear contradiction of the pilot's assumption that they'd solved their problem.
Yeah, we've had an engine running rough, and we've been getting some smoke into the cockpit, which by closing the engine down looks like we've stopped it.
Nothing then on the flight deck told them in words of one syllable, loud and clear, that they hadn't shut down the correct engine, and so that they were quite happy that they had.
The left engine vibration gauge was reading high. It's the size of a 20-pence piece, but it was the only indication the pilots had that all was not well.
What there was a small cursor showing an out-of-range reading on one instrument.
There was an instrument saying, "Excuse me, but I think," rather than "Hey, look."
Yes, very polite instrument indeed.
But that discreet warning was all there was to correct their false and fatal assumption.
The location of that instrument on the panel itself is in a secondary position. So therefore, it is obviously not classified as something that carries primary importance. The design of the gauge itself, it doesn't have red danger zone markings whenever you reach maximum values, as other secondary instruments possess.
Over history, vibration meters have been looked at a little bit askance as not being totally reliable. Apparently these new machines are in fact extremely reliable. This is something we would like to have known at the time.
Kevin Hunt had had 7,000 hours experience on planes like the DC-9, where vibration gauges were so unreliable that pilots were actually allowed to fly with them disconnected. On the new 737-400, the gauge was extremely accurate, but the pilots might not have believed it, even if they'd managed to see it.
Obviously, vibration and vibration gauges hadn't been at the front of anybody's mind, really, because these gauges weren't provided with a warning light, and if people had regarded them as important, then they would have been. Had there been an out-of-range warning, a flashing light or something like that attached to this, that probably the accident wouldn't have happened.
The official report recommended that vibration gauges be fitted with a device to attract the pilot's attention. But the CAA rejected the recommendation on the grounds that such warning devices would give the gauge a disproportionate significance. It was a selling point of the new 737 that the instruments were simply a more sophisticated version of those in the old plane. That meant that the airlines who bought it wouldn't have to waste valuable pilot time intensively retraining their crews. For British Midland, at its Castle Donington headquarters, as for any other airline, all that was needed to license a pilot for the new plane was a minimal pilot conversion course.
The basic conversion course onto the 400 was at East Midlands, and it consisted of a slide lecture, over the course of a morning and part of an afternoon. And that was it.
This booklet, comparing the 737-400 with the 300, completed the theoretical training.
The training that we did have in no way prepared us for the emergency that we had that night. And because there was no 400 simulator available for this aircraft, we went through a very informal ground school, followed by a test paper, a multi-choice test paper.
There was no simulator training because there was no such facility in Britain at the time. Ray Thilthorpe, who left the RAF Red Arrows for British Midland, was surprised at how short the course was.
I only knew of one other training system, and that's a military training system. So here I come onto the scene, and I go through a system which is quite alien to me. I was very uncomfortable with it. I was uncomfortable in that the style of putting information across, 35mm slides with an American voiceover just telling me what each slide does, is not enough. It's not deep enough.
Pilots got their hands-on training on regular scheduled flights. This, passengers may like to know, is standard and accepted practice in the industry.
I found that after doing that course, I was still almost learning to fly the airplane by default, wanting to put my hands on things, say, what does this do? What does this do? But yet it was signed up in my license saying that I was qualified on that type, but I was still saying, hey, look at this. There's something, I didn't know that.
The routine of shuttle flights would give the pilots time to get to know the plane, as long as nothing went wrong.
Because they hadn't done a simulator detail before flying the aircraft, that means that although they'd already done a number of sectors on this aircraft with this new instrumentation, the first time that they ever saw the instrumentation showing them a problem was when they'd got a real problem, because they'd never seen it showing a problem in the simulator.
The official report recommends that all crews should have simulator training. The CAA agrees that it's a good idea, but passengers again may like to know, rejected the recommendation because simulators are not always available.